everybody, and welcome back to another video. Today I'll be bringing you my top 15 books of 2015. Picking a favorites list was incredibly difficult, and my list of honorable mentions would be even longer than this list, so unfortunately I will not be going into them. I will instead pick the 15 books / series that even after I read them, I was still thinking about them, I was still talking about them. Even if I read them in January, in December, I was still thinking about them in some way, shape, or form. I will say though, before I actually start, that none of these books, with the exception of my top 3, are in any particular order. The only way I organized them was from earliest read to most recent read, until we hit the top 3. Anyway, let's actually get going. My first favorite on this list is The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins. I read this in January, and I actually listened to it. I myself identify on the agnosticism, atheism spectrum. I haven't done enough sort of like serious introspective thinking or research to really decide where I fall on that, but this was a book that I had been told is really good for people who are on that spectrum or are trying to figure things out, and I really enjoyed it. I know that Richard Dawkins is a pretty divisive figure, and this book is a pretty divisive book because Dawkins really does not mince words at all. He's very upfront and very challenging, and he's very opinionated, and I could see why he would very easily offend people, but in my case I actually found it entertaining. So this book was sort of equal parts psychology, sociology, and memoir, and I found it a really entertaining listen. The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. This is another book which I listened to as an audiobook in January and rated a 5 out of 5 stars. One of the first stories I recall hearing as a kid was that of the Iliad. The Iliad is one of my favorite stories. It's just such an incredible book, or poem, I should say. And so I get really intrigued and really anxious when I see that people are playing with that story, because I have a really bad tendency to then nitpick a little more when it comes to those books. But I had heard a lot about the Song of Achilles here on BookTube and from other people who'd read it, and I was like, alright, well, it's at the library, I'll listen to it, and I thought it was fantastic. It definitely takes the kind of more modern academic approach of homoerotic analysis between the characters of Achilles and Patroclus, but it ends up using that to spin this really beautiful tragedy that's all about like love and loss amidst horrific war, and then also the wrath of gods, which is always a good thing. I thought the gods were used really, really well in this book. I haven't read book 4, so nobody spoil me, but I've got books 1 to 3 of the Falling Kingdom series by Morgan Rhodes. I read books 1 to 2 in January. I own the paperbacks. And then in October, I finally read Gathering Darkness, which was the 3rd book in that series. I did apparently win a copy of Frozen Tides from a First Reads giveaway on Goodreads, and it has not arrived yet, but once it does, I can guarantee you I'm going to be diving right on into that. I'm very excited to get book 4 because book 3 left off on a cliffhanger. Anyway, this series, every time I'd seen it brought up on BookTube, and I had seen it brought up a lot, it was always kind of pitched as Game of Thrones for young adults, which when you look at it on a very shallow, like surface level, it's an epic fantasy series dealing with warring dynasties and the political intrigue that employs the use of multiple narrators, so yeah, that's an accurate description of it. I ended up really enjoying this book, I think because Ms. Rhodes is fantastic at writing very distinct character voices, which means all of these different POVs, you know who's speaking because they have very specific thought processes and very distinct narrative voices. And I think that's a necessity for this series when you have so many characters, because if I can't figure out who they are, then we have a serious problem. Because I need to know all of the characters because they're all from different dynasties and they all have different motivations, and while they interweave and interconnect, some of them don't even meet. So it really helps that Ms. Rhodes is fantastic at writing character voices. The Queen of the Tearling series by Erica Johansson, of which 2 out of 3 books are currently published, so The Queen of the Tearling and The Invasion of the Tearling. I'm sure like a lot of people who are now aware of this series, I came about it because Emma Watson had spoken so highly of it, I believe on her Twitter, and then I also heard she was set to star in a film adaptation, and I think she was throwing a lot of the money at the adaptation, and she praised it as something that was very feminist. In addition, the author wrote a very fantastic article, I believe over on BuzzFeed, that was called Why We Need Ugly Heroines, and I really enjoyed what she had to say in that. So I knew this was something I really wanted to read. And what I loved most about this novel is that the main character is a teenager, but it's about her blossoming into a young woman by having to take command of a kingdom that has really no idea who she is and no reason to trust her. Our protagonist makes a lot of mistakes, and there are consequences to every action that she makes, but she learns from it and she grows from it, which is something that I really deeply appreciate. The other thing I love, as someone who is on the ace spectrum and not always a huge fan of it, there's not that much romance going on here. There's sexual tension with some characters, and there is sex briefly in like the second book with our protagonist, but there's no character thrown in for the sake of being a romantic partner. There's no focus on romance. It's much more about the politics, about trying to save this kingdom from complete destruction, either from within or from the Mordmesne Queen, who is the ultimate antagonist of the story. And I thought it was absolutely fantastic, and I'm incredibly excited for the fate of the Tierling. I'm really curious to see how the series wraps up, and to get some answers to at least one big question that's been haunting the series, which is who is the protagonist's father? That's something I really, really want to know. In March, I read one of my most anticipated books of the year, which was A Darker Shade of Magic by V.E. Schwab, also known as Victoria Schwab. I've been a fan of Miss Schwab for a couple of years now. I was first introduced to her through her young adult series, The Archived, which is really very clever, and that was the first thing that had always struck me about her writing, was that I thought it was incredibly clever, and her worlds were very well thought out. And then I read her book Vicious, which is one of the most fantastic books involving super villains I've ever read. And I read it and I said, if only this could be made into a movie, and I would love to try and write the script, though I could probably never make it happen. I'd probably have issues even finishing it. It's such a fantastic story. So when I heard she was coming out with a new fantasy, that it was going to involve parallel worlds, and that all these worlds were mostly going to be centered around the city of London, it was like, count me in. You're including all these things that I love. And once again, I got a novel that was supremely clever, the world very well thought out, very well detailed, and characters who were fantastic. I loved our main character, Cal. I think he was a great person to follow. And I love the fact that it wasn't all just about, oh, look, parallel worlds. There was political intrigue, there's thieves, there's family drama, there's adopted family drama, and as far as I know, the sequel is set to also include pirates. I mean, she's just throwing everything I love at me, and I thought it was a really fantastic start to a series, and even if it hadn't been a start to a series, it was a great novel in its own right. Also in March, I read the first two books in the Winner's Trilogy by Maria Rutkowski. I'll admit I bought The Winner's Curse as a cover buy off of Book Outlet because I had heard about it, but I thought the design of the hardback was fantastic. The use of having the very feminine girl in like the big poofy dress, she looks like she's fainting, but she's got a knife. She's gripping onto the R. I loved the font. The fact that the spine has the knife here at the bottom. I just thought it was a really great design, and there was just enough in the blurb to intrigue me, so I bought it, and I think it only cost me a couple dollars, so it was like, all right. Yeah, I bought it as a cover buy, and then I didn't read it for a long time. I got really worried it was just gonna be a more romantic story than it was, and ooh, I was very wrong. This book is actually a very richly developed political thriller. I mean, it's all about politics, and it's an incredibly lavish world, which you can guess from her being in a ball gown on the cover. Because of aristocratic intrigue and like infighting and the politics of it, nobody can say what they mean, nobody can say anything that they want, and that actually makes the story far more interesting and far more dynamic. So of course, the moment I finished the first one, I moved right on to the second one, and what I loved from both of them is that there are consequences to what can seem like even a kind act. Everything has a consequence, everything has a price, and characters have to deal with the fact that oftentimes they do things for the good of others at their own detriment. And I really love that I'm seeing more novels doing this, because one of my biggest pet peeves, especially in YA, is often that the consequences to people's actions aren't real enough to me. Like, they're not really dealt with in enough depth. And I love the fact that this is basically a series that's all about the consequence of one action, and it's fantastic. Would it be any list without Samantha Shannon? Absolutely not. So I have to include The Mime Order on this list. This is the second book in the Bone series, which I sort of personally call the Scion Chronicles, because I think that's just a way cooler title than just the Bone season series. I read this in March as a hardback. When it came out, I'd pre-ordered it. It also means I was lucky enough to get a little copy of the pamphlet on the merits of unnaturalness, I believe it's called. I've talked about the Bone season before. It was my favorite book I read in 2013. I did a very long review of it, and I like to jokingly call the Bone season my gateway drug book back into the world of reading for pleasure, because when I was in school, I really didn't read that much for pleasure because I had so much to read already, and I was just burned out by the time I would get to books I enjoyed. And I remember picking up the Bone season on a whim and loving it so much that it was just sort of like I'm back in the world of reading, and it was fantastic. I can't say too much about the Mime Order without spoiling a lot of the Bone seasons. I will say that the Mime Order I really liked because the focus shifts from the primary setting of the Bone season, which is Sheol, back into London. Scion controlled London, and we're seeing the underworld and the underbelly of these syndicates that are run by the clairvoyants and all of the politics that are involved in there. And we start to see the seeds of revolution have sort of been sown. Now they're really starting to take root, and it's so fantastic. I love how detailed Miss Shannon is in developing her world. I love the meticulous level of care that has gone into it because it makes it feel all the more real. I get a really good sense of what this world looks like, what it feels like, how it works, why people are motivated to behave the way they do. And for me, that's what makes a fantastic story like this, where the focus really is on the place as much as it is also the people. And the ending was spectacular. I'm supremely ready for the Song Rising, and I'm so glad I discovered this series. It's absolutely fantastic. If you are into what is essentially a dystopian paranormal fantastical thriller, yeah, I know, it's like 12 categories. You need to go check out the Bone season. It's wonderful. And if you're like me, it'll make you feel supremely underaccomplished because I am the same age as Samantha Shannon, and wow, I just feel supremely underaccomplished. In April, I got an arc of Uprooted by Naomi Novik, and okay. Naomi Novik is most famous for her Temeraire series, which is basically the idea of what if they had dragons during the Napoleonic Wars, and those were basically used as air cavalry, and I never really liked it all that much. The issue wasn't with the characters or the world. I really enjoyed both of those. My issue was with the glacial pace of the story, and I found it very frustrating to keep reading, and that I never got into the cadence of the writing because I found the pacing so frustratingly slow. And I was really nervous I would have the exact same problem where I loved the characters and the story and the world, but could not stand how slow the story went. Thankfully, this book caught me within like its opening paragraph, and I was completely immersed into this dark, twisted wood, and I loved the fairy tale-like presentation of it, but it was much more like Diane or Wynne Jones, like Howl's Moving Castle meets Neil Gaiman kind of fairy tale. So there's a definite darkness and an edge and a bite to the whole thing that I absolutely adored. And I remember finishing this book and immediately telling several people who I knew that they needed to read it when it released, I believe in July. And when I saw that my online book club was doing it, I was like, I will happily just read this book again. Happily read this book again because it's fantastic. In May, I continued my quest to read as much of Haruki Murakami as I can get my hands on, and finally read an ebook version of After Dark, which I rated a 5 out of 5 stars, and I'm firmly convinced somebody needs to make that into a film. It's even written with camera movement. Stylized camera movement is written into the narrative. So I don't understand why nobody has made a movie of this. Probably they can't get the rights to it, which is an absolute tragedy because I think it would make a fantastic film because it's all about atmosphere. It takes place in those hours between midnight and dawn, and that's it. And so it's a supremely short novel, surprisingly short actually. And it leaves you not necessarily needing more, but kind of like selfishly wanting more. So I finished it and I went, I would love more of this, even though I know I don't need any more of this. Like, the story doesn't need any more. The story's done. It's complete. Like, that's a perfectly constructed story. I just very, very guiltily and selfishly want more because I enjoyed it so much. Like a lot of people, I'm sure, I read The Martian by Andy Weir. I read this as an ebook. I rated it 5 out of 5 stars, and I loved it. I had avoided it for the longest time because I'd heard it was really scientific, and I'm kind of science impaired, so that made me really nervous. I was afraid I wouldn't be able to enjoy it. It's often a problem I have with a lot of hard science fiction in that if it gets too technical and too sciencey, which I'm sure a lot of people really enjoy, I kind of get turned off because I feel like a moron. And I was really worried that's what The Martian was going to be like. But the narrative voices of Mark Watney and all the other people who you meet throughout the book were so conversational and so accessible that even when they were just sort of like explaining a ton of science at me, I could at least think that I understood part of it, and that made it more fun. These people felt real because of the way they spoke, the way they thought to themselves, the way they presented themselves to others and interacted with other people, and all of the situations around them, and that's what I loved. These felt like real people. I felt like a fly on the wall or like in the middle of a documentary. Given the conceit of the novel, where I know Watney survives because he's been able to record these things, I still worried about him all the time, tells you the story was good, the characters were good, and I clearly had gotten invested in the whole thing. Because my brain sort of like let the conceit fly out the window and was just like, oh my god, this was happening to him? Even though clearly I should logically know that he survives, whatever it was that had happened to him. What can you do? It's clearly just a well-told story. In August, I read a book which definitely struck me intensely, and that was The Strange and Beautiful Sorrows of Ava Lavender by Leslie Walton. I read this as an ebook from my library, I rated it 5 stars, and immediately bought it as a paperback because I knew I wanted it. There are some books you read where they are so beautiful that it's literally just like they're breaking your heart into a million pieces the whole time you read them. It's like they slip right between your ribs, just hang out in that little spot between your ribcage and your heart, and just hang out there. And this was one of those books. The writing was absolutely poetic. It was hypnotic and entrancing and musical, and I just felt swept away. It was sort of like the entire world vanished while I was reading this book. When I finished it, I felt like I'd come out of a deep sleep, just unprepared entirely to let go of the lushness of the tragedy, of the violence, and just the overwhelming amount of love that was in the narrative of this book. And even thinking about it now, I'm still amazed by it, and it's one of those books that just sort of moves you with how beautiful it is. In September, I read another one of my very anticipated books of the year, which was Standoff by Andrew Smith, the sequel to Winger. I bought it as a hardback when it came out, I rated it 5 out of 5 stars, and I really can't talk about it without spoiling Winger, which I don't want to do. I will say it's one of the most fantastic YA contemporary duologies I've ever read, and it has a male protagonist, which is, I find in YA contemporary is actually kind of rare when I read them. Alright, we're at the big 3. So these books clinched their spot on this list by the impact they left upon me. So it would be months after having read these books, and I would still be talking about them, still recommending them to people. I will say you will not find anything by Pierce Brown here, because if you saw my top 14 of 2014 list, I included Golden Sun in that list because I actually read that in 2014. Trust me, Morningstar will probably end up on my top 16 of 2016 list, but for now, let's move into my top 3 of 2015. In September, I borrowed an entire trilogy from the library and read it in the span of like 2 days, and then kicked myself for not having read it before, only because I honestly thought the covers were kind of hideous. Sorry. That is the Girl of Fire and Thorns trilogy by Ray Carson. There's a quote from the final novel of this series, The Bitter Kingdom, that says, "It was not perfection, but it was perfect." And that's kind of how I feel about this series. I became completely ensnared in this mystical journey that our protagonists must embark upon. And this series, I mean, it has politics, there's racial and religious tension, there's, battles, adventures to far off places, love and loss, and a heroine who stands on her own 2 feet to say what she wants and says, I can do this. And sometimes says, maybe I want some help. I know I can do it, but I would like some help. I think that's a pretty powerful thing. There's an overwhelming amount of feminism in this trilogy, which I had not been told about, and I wish someone had told me about, because watching our protagonist grow over the course of the 3 books was one of the most wonderful experiences I ever had. In January, I read an arc of an upcoming book, literally just a couple days before it was releasing, and even as the year ended, I knew this book was going to be in this list because I was still thinking about it, and it was still making me cry. It was still eliciting all the emotions, and that is All the Bright Places by Jennifer Niven. Obviously, as you can tell, I read it as a paperback arc. I rated it 5 out of 5 stars, and had it not been for the book that you will see at number 1, this would have been number 1, and it lost by very narrow margin. I read this book twice in the span of a week. I was in absolute pieces emotionally, and I have found that when authors tackle the tough stuff, as it's called, topics of mental illness in teens, and suicide and loss and grief, I sometimes feel there's an element of, I don't always believe it. This is just me. please feel free to disagree. Not with this one. You could tell the story was incredibly personal to Ms. Niven, and she has spoken many a time about the inspiration of it being a boy that she had loved and lost when she was younger. And I think that shines through. And I mean, I could get up on a soapbox and talk about how this book is really important for people to maybe understand some aspects of mental illness in young adults that maybe they don't understand or aren't quite familiar with. But I really don't have to. I don't have to talk for this book. The book speaks for itself because there's so much heart in her writing. And anything else she writes, I'm in. I'm gonna read it. She's become an auto-buy-author because I loved this book so much and I hold it very close. It's one of those that I turn to when I'm not having a great day and I need to flip to some passages where I'm like, this is a character who sort of understands how I feel right now. And here we are, the number one. I should have known with the number one when one of the two authors of this book said this was without doubt the coolest book they had ever written and that they were pretty sure I'd never read anything like it. Oh, they were so right. Illuminated by J. Kristoff and Amy Kaufman, the first book in the Illuminated files. I read this book as a digital ARC in June, which meant at the time I had to read it on my iPhone because I didn't have an iPad, and reading it on my computer made my eyes hurt. Reading on the phone wasn't exactly a fantastic experience because this is a very visual novel. Can you imagine trying to read this on an iPhone? Can you consider that? It was not very fun. But despite that, the story was so good, the characters so fantastic. Didn't matter. I was still gonna trudge through reading it on the iPhone anyway. Saying that this book blew my mind is a complete understatement. This book left me in shock. It rang out my emotions and then shot me out of an airlock into the cold, dark vacuum of space and just said, ha 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 ha, we warned you. This took so many elements from science fiction and from horror that are gonna be very familiar, and then cobbled them all together and said, I can make those all work. And you're sitting there going, no, none of these shouldn't work together. You shouldn't be able to balance all of these elements in one story. But they did. One, the story is that strong. Two, the characters are that believable and are that strong. Three, it's the construction. Compiling it like it's a massive top secret bind up of a dossier and all that loveliness. That's why I think it ultimately also worked, is that the conceit, for lack of a better word, of the design helps. You could tell this story without it, but I read it and I don't want it to be told any other way. I want to read it like it's a little top secret bind up, like I'm getting like leaked information and I'm sitting here just enjoying the heck out of it going, holy crow, like what even is this? And wow, they said that's the current death toll? Like, it keeps the suspense. And it's left me completely amazed. I've been babbling about it to all of my friends, especially in book club, since I read it, and I am so ready for Gemina, which is going to be the sequel. I do understand it is being pronounced as a soft G. I think like the word Gemini, except Gemina. And I need the sequel so badly. I'm so excited to see what happens next and how all of this corporate intrigue meets deadly virus outbreak and crazy AI and two characters who are fantastic. I want to know how it all keeps going. And I am so thankful to Random House for giving me access to the ARC, because that made my June when I read it. And then also I immediately set an alert in my phone for October when this released. I believe it was October 27th. Set an alert in my phone so that I could get it, immediately when it released. I don't have a problem. What are you talking about? Until next time, you guys.